What is up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of the Sound Money Podcast. I'm your host, Steve McGarry. And one of the things that I'm going to be going over today is about not only a presidential candidate's policy about zoning and owning and making more affordable real estate for people in the United States, but I'm also going to be going over marginal contribution as a economic concept. So if that sounds interesting, do not forget to stick around. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe. And we talk about everything with business and new technology. And one of the most interesting things recently is around this presidential candidate, Andrew Yang. He was an econ major, just like I was, and he's been presenting a lot of really interesting concepts that I've been covering on the channel if you're watching on YouTube, and also the podcast if you're listening on iTunes and Spotify. So what I wanted to talk about today, first, before I go into the zoning concept that Yang is proposing that he will implement, is I wanted to go over what marginal contribution is. So I studied a lot in game theory in college, which is not as entertaining as it may sound. It's not as entertaining as video games, for example. Game theory is more so talking about competitive games and cooperative games. So, you may have heard of John Nash, and I studied a lot under John Nash and about John Nash. I mean, he was played in the movie, I believe Russell Crowe played him. But basically, in a competition, there's usually going to be, when you're competing with others, you are going to take action so that you have the best outcome no matter what happens to your opponent. So you want to make sure that you benefit and that the other opponent has nothing. It doesn't matter what they do. And in cooperative games, you want to work together for a main goal. Like you want to work together as a cohesive mission to reach a goal. And, there's a lot of different things that I don't want to dive down into too much here. The reason is I'm building up a case for some of these concepts here. So that I'm going to talk about Yang's policy. So when it comes to competitive games, it comes to cooperative games where we have to work together, for example, as a country, let's say, and a coalition. There's coalitions that form in all different types of games. And also it's important to think about game theory isn't just games. It could be all the way down to we all go out to dinner tomorrow night, and it's just who divvying up how much each person pays. That's an example of a game theory concept. So what I wanted to talk about was that a coalition is a little co-op group that, works together, and they come up with ways to work together and help each other in a fair way reach a certain mission. And I see it as a lot of the game theory around something like a universal basic income and some of these things that Andrew's proposing in his on his website under policies are very cooperative, like in terms of game theory. Where in terms of game theory wise, it is very, very, very similar to some of the concept that I'm familiar with. And there's no need for Nash equilibrium because we're not necessarily talking about competitive games. We're going to be talking more so about cooperative, because in competitive games, that's more so in relevance to like business and things like that. And what I wanted to talk about was there's a concept called marginal contribution. Now, marginal contribution is a very fancy way of saying that when you're removed from a game, what value is taken from that game. So it is a way of measuring, usually in situations that are relevant to something called the Shapley, which was in game theory that I studied, and that is where you divide gains and costs. Like you're trying to figure out the gains and costs in a cooperative effort and of all of the different players in a fair way, and see how people benefit with the gains and the cost associated with that cooperative game, and that is under Shapley. And one of the things about marginal contribution is when you're removed from something like, in game theory, you have to make sure that you're keeping track of those values. So with Shapley, this is where you are, for example, I'm making 10 cookies and my partner is making 20 cookies. Together, we can streamline the process. We can make 40 cookies together. We can all sit down and I can make the dough and they can work the oven, and we will proceed to just streamline the entire process, and we can make 40 cookies together. So separately, I can make 10, they can make 20, and together we can streamline it, crush it, and make 40 cookies. Now, where things get interesting is where we talk about the marginal contribution of each of us. Once we are in this streamlined 40 cookie organization, what happens when I leave? And let's say my work has been valued at 15 cookies, and the other partner in that business venture for cookies is then valuing their work at, let's say, 30 cookies. So we need to average our cookies out. Or 25 cookies and 15 cookies, let's say. We need to average that out, and then that's what we each, our marginal contribution could be under the Shapley concept. So when we're together, it's more because it's streamlined, and then we have to average our values based on our contributions when we're removed, and that is how we come up with the Shapley theory of game theory. So now, coming into zoning, the second part of this. Now that we've got the groundwork, I've oversimplified those concepts really intensely and fast. So if you're still sticking along, thank you for sticking around. We're listening on the front of game theory in the beginning, and now we are going to transition into the part where I talk about zoning. Now, homeownership is definitely one of the most important, if not the most important, key way of accumulating wealth in the United States as well as globally. You have all different ways of generating wealth through a property, a home. You have your appreciation that goes up an average of 3% a year. You have your debt pay down or your mortgage pay down. So every month that you pay towards that principal amount and that interest that you owe, you are paying down and gaining equity in that house. So your appreciation's going up and that debt is going down as you're paying it down. And that delta between the two is equity in the house. So those are big generators there. And in terms of generating wealth, there's also, the ability to rent it out and cash flow. So you could even have somebody doing it for you. You could put a tenant in there and they would be paying it down. So you have like three huge pillars to wealth creation in property. So Andrew Yang is suggesting that they're going to be making very, very new and progressive zoning laws. And this is going to make it much easier for people to afford affordable housing, being able to rent or buy. And there are a lot of interesting things in this space that are coming out, like rent to own and things like that I've seen. But there is a concept that is what he mainly drives home around NIMBY, which is not in my backyard. And Maine zoning laws are just an absolute nightmare. I lived in San Francisco for 5 years, and it was crazy there, man. I could not believe what was taking place in San Francisco with all of the renting and the real estate there. It was nuts. So since since I've gone over briefly, way too fast, I've gone over marginal contribution when you're removed from something, what is left, what was my value contributing to that. And then we've gone over Shapley with the cookie example of where if we work together, we can streamline and make more cookies. But once we step out, we have to average our values that we're putting in, even though I may have contributed a little bit less and my partner may have contributed a little bit more, but we have to average based on the Shapley concept. And now that we have gone over that is something in a cooperative game, which is what I mentioned earlier, is around kind of this belief that we are all working together in this humanity-driven concept. So when it comes to zoning, this is a fundamental human base point here, where everyone deserves a clean place to sleep. Everyone deserves water. They deserve a roof over their head. and the ability to stay safe. And this is something that is very near and dear to me, and it's very near and dear to many people that I respect and I know personally, in the fact that we need to help people just have that basic right, that human right of owning a home or just renting a home or being in a place that is safe at night. I think that that is something that you could call a cooperative game where we are all working together to try and reach that. Now, lowering things like these zoning laws that were in San Francisco and just absolutely insanity in San Francisco, and also Andrew Yang mentions in New York City, where he's originally from, and it presents a huge problem. So one of the things that is needed to be solved is the zoning laws have to be changed, and there needs to be new housing, and there needs to be a complete shift in how we think about this. And he's going to present multiple options on how he is going to change this. And the two claims are this. As president, Andrew Yang says that he's going to work with localities to relax zoning ordinances for the purpose of increasing the development of affordable housing. And then he's going to encourage the building of new innovative housing options like micro apartments and communal living for people in high-density urban areas. So those are the two 1-2 punches of how he's going to do it. Relax zoning ordinances. I can definitely see that being easy. Working with developers to build up micro apartments, I think that's going to take some time there and might be a little bit more difficult. Actually, I'm not quite sure which one of these would be more difficult, but they are both relatively good options, because the goal of more affordable housing, everyone can agree that that is good. I don't know of anyone that would disagree with having more affordable housing, because everybody needs a roof. Everyone needs shelter. It's a basic, primitive, or primal need, like a cave to go in. So everyone can agree on this. This is not a left or right thing. It's just basic concept here. So a cooperative game in game theory coming together to make it so that everyone can have the option to have the affordable housing, and that when someone is removed or someone gets kicked out or someone doesn't have the ability to get into that house, that we are all part of measuring the marginal contribution that person has put forward in the society by changing GDP, and we could then measure the value in which that person is putting into the GDP in a correct way, in a new way of like mental health and all of these happiness scores and things like that. And there is a marginal contribution to every single person. And if everyone can just have a home or a property or something that they live in, that is a marginal contribution in a way where if they are removed, that is a bad thing. We do not want to just be, kicking people out. Nobody wants to do that ever, but I know that it happens. And in San Francisco, it was absolutely nuts seeing that firsthand. And I definitely feel that in a cooperative game, in game theory, we should not allow these types of things to go on, but they do. And I think that looking at Yang's proposals through the perspective of game theory, with micro apartments coming into play, communal living coming into play, and working with the localities on relaxing zoning, I do feel that we have the ability to make it a cooperative effort or cooperative gain, so that when people do get removed, at least we divide and average what those contributions have been. And I know that was all at once there, but the purpose was basically just to lay it out for you guys in a very technical way with all of these different game theory concepts, and just letting you know that if your neighbor all of a sudden gets struck by hard times and they are, they have to move or they have to leave, it's important to think about it as a cooperative game, and that when they leave or they have to leave, that it's an average. It is an average across the board. So that's what I wanted to leave you guys with. And it is a very empathetic way of looking at how we're going to change. And I want to make sure that that makes its way into everybody's mind when we're thinking about housing, especially, because everybody needs to have that right to have a place to live and sleep safely. So that's it for this episode. I hope that made sense. I mean, marginal contribution is really deep, and I just skimmed across the surface. And so is this policy concept of making more affordable housing, and making it all together, bringing it all together was kind of tricky there. But I think between Shapley and the competitive and cooperative game theories, I do believe that it's a cool thought. And it's a cool brain exercise and thought exercise to think about in terms of how we could make a change and how these policies and types like this in the conversation are important. Like, we just need to discuss this, making it widely available for people. And that's it. I will see you guys on the next episode of the Sound Money Podcast. If you like this video or episode, please stop a like. It really helps the podcast. Also, if you're brand new here, think about subscribing. We're going to be doing a lot more content in the near future, as well as some cool interviews that I have lined up. So that is it. I will see you guys on the next episode of the Sound Money Podcast.